All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Thinking Cap podcast. I'm your host, Jack Timperley. I'm joined by our producer and guest for today's show, Mr. Jake Olinar. We've
Great to
got a
see you
great
again.
show.
Great to see you again, Jack. Thanks for having me. Great to talk to you again, ladies and gentlemen. And we have an interesting show for you today.
We sure do. Excellent. So, we've got a couple of announcements first. YouTube Music seems to not quite be rolling out podcasting yet, but we are ready to go whenever that does occur, and you should be able to listen to the Thinking Cap podcast on YouTube Music soon. I don't have a timeline for you yet. It's based on whenever YouTube decides to roll it out, but we're ready for it. Otherwise, you can watch us on YouTube, we're on Rumble, on Facebook, LinkedIn, and I think that's about it. We've got an Instagram page as well, but we can't exactly shoot live on that page. Other than that, we've got a new Thinking Cap mug for you all. I just designed it and is ready to go. It is very cool. It's a black 11-ounce mug. You can get it at jacktimperley.com/the Thinking Cap or shop. If you just go to jacktimperley.com, you'll see various links for where you can buy the Thinking Cap hats, like this one, or you can get the mug. Again, it's a black mug, got the Thinking Cap podcast logo on it. Very exciting, very good looking, very cool. So get excited for that. Go get your mugs, go get your caps, especially your Thinking Caps. If you haven't already, make sure to put those Thinking Caps on right now as we get into today's topic: time travel. Woo!
Woo!
I am a avid sci-fi time travel enthusiast, I like to call it, and to my knowledge, JQ is as well. I'm wearing my Back to the Future Marty McFly suit today. Very exciting. I don't get to put this on very often. And so, for the occasion, you're getting Marty McFly today. And as great as that movie is, it's got some complications. It doesn't follow realistic rules of time travel, which is too bad. But it's again, it's still arguably the greatest film trilogy of all time. I would
Well,
say.
unfortunately, in real life, we don't have a Doc Brown to help us out with that.
No, we don't, unfortunately. But we've got movies to start theorizing about how time travel might work. And I know there's been a lot of physicists that have talked about time travel from a quantum standpoint, from a realistic standpoint, and I've listened to um, a lot of recordings, seen a lot of movies, obviously, and I've come to some ideas, come to some conclusions about the realities of time travel. Because if we think about this, Avengers Endgame, I think, was the closest to a realistic standpoint of time travel that we've come to yet. They botched some things for the story. I think when they came back to the future, which I'll explain my theory on that. But time travel in itself is obviously very risky, and I think based on if we can get the mechanics right of time travel, in theory and in practicality, we can begin to see time travel is not what it's all made out to be. We would actually not benefit from time traveling because of the way the time travel should actually work. I say should very loosely because we're talking about the reality of time travel, right? Not the way it should be, but the, arguably the way that it is. Yeah, it's all theory. We can't actually test it unless people have already created time travel, and if that's the case, we wouldn't hear about it anyways. But the reason for that is because, let's think about this. Let's say we invent time travel right now. Alright, we get into our DeLorean, and we travel back to, I don't know, where do you want to travel back to, if you could?
Oh, for me, I would
Yeah,
love to travel back to. I would love to travel back to the time of the Beatles back in 1964. You know, they're my favorite band. So,
1964. Alright, we're going back to 1964 then, to the Beatles. As soon as we travel back from this point in our timeline, based on rules of Avengers Endgame, when you travel back to the past, that past becomes your future, which can't now be changed by whatever happens in the past. And so, when you inadvertently time travel to 1964, you're effectively removing yourself from this timeline. So, think about all of your family, all of your friends you are leaving behind in this timeline so that they will continue in a timeline in which you disappeared and never came back. You might return later on to a very similar timeline in which you do return, but in your, quantumly speaking, in your vibrational timeline, you are removed from the remainder of your timeline's future, and you don't return. So your friends and family in that timeline live as if you never came back. So we'll think about that. And then, so when you time travel back to 1964, you are now putting yourself in a new timeline in which you existed in that time. No matter what you change, just by your physical frequency, your physical presence being in that time, you are effectively creating a new timeline in which you existed there. So, anything you change in that past on purpose or on accident, right? We could even talk about the butterfly phenomenon. Right? You step on a butterfly, all breaks loose in the future, and you end up destroying that timeline. That would actually be okay. And the reason is because you're not destroying your own timeline that you came from, because you cannot return to the timeline, the exact vibrational timeline that you came from. Your timeline that you came from will continue without you, but the timeline that you create when you go back in time to 1964, you can destroy that timeline. You might destroy your future, because, depending on what you end up doing, because that past becomes your future, but your life as you knew it in your past is all maintained in that timeline. Because how could it not? Because those are memories in your mind that, in your perception of time, had to have occurred and have to continue to exist in order for you to exist in the new timeline, not be obliterated as soon as you arrive in 1964. So that's why the timeline that you leave has to continue on. It has to. It has to continue without you, because if, say, you went back to 1964, you had a great time, right? You listened to the Beatles, you you continue to grow up in that timeline. Would you want to return to the future eventually? Or would you want to stay in 1964 or continue in that timeline and grow old and die?
That's a tough question. There are like pros and cons to everything. It's like at the same time you think about all the consequence. Well, at the same time you think about the consequences you have to face through if you decide to make that choice. If you decide to make that choice to stay in that timeline, eventual timeline, you create like maybe create like some interference to that particular timeline and adding that to your life. Would like would things be the same as it was then if you were a part of it? So
Well, it ultimately, arguably, I would argue it doesn't matter because you've created a new timeline. You can do anything you want to that timeline. You
hmm
could start
yeah, I mean look,
World War
I mean
II
yeah,
early if you wanted to go back
yeah.
further. You could start
I
World
think
War III.
one yeah I think one show that sticks out to me regarding that is The Flash. When Barry, when he traveled, multiple times throughout the show, and whether it's intentional or not, like, he created some scenarios on his own to uh, to make changes in that timeline. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter. I mean, at times, like he faced uh, some of those villains and stuff when he went through the time portal, and who knows what the end result would be.
I'm glad you brought up the Flash because he adheres to different rules of time travel than we're talking about than Endgame. He went back, he created that timeline, but then he undid that timeline by
hmm
going back and undoing essentially what he did to create it in the first place. That created a third timeline. Then when he returned to the future, it was the future of that timeline. But the the problem with that is when he went back to the future of that new timeline, that's still just one possible future. Traveling back to the past is different from traveling to the future. When you travel to the future, it is one out of infinite possibilities, infinite choices, infinite decisions to be made. One possible future. So even if you went back to that future,
hmm
it could all be a lie. It doesn't really matter. It could be something completely different. It could be something completely similar. But the timeline that you came from, your friends and family, from that timeline that you know, love, and admire, those people are no longer in your life. When you go back to the future, the new, in this case of the Flash, they've got characters like Cisco and Caitlin, or the scientists and the the superhero enthusiast, we'll call him, the techno guy and the guy behind the chair, and so they might
Orson
have
Welles,
a
yeah, Professor
right.
Doctor Wells, man, Doctor Wells.
Oh, Dr. Wells, oof, don't even get me started. So
Watch the Flash,
those,
everybody. You'll watch the Flash, everybody. You'll enjoy
yes,
Doctor
they're on
Wells.
season 9. On season 9, last season. Can't
True.
believe it. We started watching it. I started watching it in high school. I don't know about you. For
Oh, I
me, it
started
was
watching
sophomore
my senior year of high school, like
year.
literally.
Yeah,
So it's crazy how long it is. It's been almost 10 years. So, but
yeah,
yeah, the purest
amazing.
example of time travel right there. So yeah, definitely,
Yeah, amazing. Too bad they didn't go to season 10. That would have been really cool. I wonder how they're going to end it. But, anyways,
absolutely, yeah.
excuse me. Anyways, in that future timeline that you return to, those people in your life may have a similar conception of who you are. No, they might know who Barry Allen is. They might have a relationship with Barry Allen. But quantum speaking, vibrationally, that is not the same Barry Allen
hmm
because another thing we got to think about is, all right, so you go back to 1964. Let's say you decide to spend a couple years there and go back to the future. You would be going back to the future, first of all, a couple years older. And depending on when you went back, let's say you went back to the time that you left in your previous timeline. There would be two of you. There would be two of you because in this new timeline, theoretically, unless you really screwed things up, you were still born and you still, let's say you still went time traveling. You would have to go to the exact moment that you left or shortly after, and you would be returning 2 years older or a couple of years older, however long you stayed in the 60s. And those people, your friends and family and everyone around you, again, will have a similar notion of who you are, but depending on what you changed in the past, could be very drastic or it could be very similar. But either way, your vibrational code, your vibrational frequency on a quantum level would be different from the one that they know, from the Jake that they know. Because the Jake that they know, let's say they went back in time as well. Alright, so they go back to their own new version of 1964. And it just becomes that loop. It's a time loop, but it's not really a loop because it's a zigzag, zigzag, zigzag. You go, oh, there's the camera. You're here, you go back to 1964, you go back to the future, future you still goes back to 1964, zigzag back to a new timeline. They go back and forth, so it goes just back and forth to different timelines. And so that's part of why that's where the multiverse comes in. Infinite timelines,
Right.
infinite possibilities. That's where the infinitude comes in on a quantum state, on a quantum level. The idea that a atom or a particle or a string, we'll say a string in this case, could be in multiple places at one time on a multi-dimensional scale. So that's what would be happening here is your string, your quantum string from your timeline cannot return to the vibrational timeline that you came from.
Mm.
And so you would have to, even if you went back to the future from 1964 and you return to a timeline in which, say, you were never born, maybe you messed something up in the past, or let's say this could be exciting. You go back to 1964, you spend 30 years there, so now you're 30 years old. You go back from 1994 to where you left at, say, 20, what is it? It's 2023. Let's say we invent time travel next year, 2024. So you go back to 2024, and you're, depending on the timeline that you go back to, again, it's one possibility of infinite decisions, infinite variations, infinite possibilities. The Jake of that timeline could have decided not to time travel. It was a split-second decision.
Mm-hmm.
They could have, well, maybe not split second because they have to go through the work of creating time travel, but it's still a decision. What if something goes wrong? What if this? What if that? What if you can't time travel? You could be going back to a future in which you don't time travel. Now there's two of you. Now there's young you that's never time traveled before, and there's you 30 years older, and you come to that timeline. Now what? Why go back to the future? Why stay in the past? Either way.
Do your parents
Right? You,
ultimately meet?
yeah, you could maybe you go and explain to your family, explain to yourself, hey, I'm you from the future, and but things are gonna be different. You're not gonna. You're now 30 years older. You're probably gonna just continue your life that be on your own terms and let little 20-some-year-old Jake live out the rest of his life. There'd be no point. There'd be no point in the time traveling.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe if we accept these mechanics of time travel, at least on a theoretical standpoint, maybe let's think about not time traveling. I mean, that's but the reason is not on a base level that everyone talks about. Oh, don't time travel because you'll mess up the timeline. No, don't don't time travel because it doesn't matter. It doesn't
Exactly.
matter because you're going to end up living a completely different life from your friends and family that you knew exactly. You're going to, it's your choice. You know, you could go back and live in the Stone Age if you want, but even if you go back to the future, that's going to be a different timeline that you now coexist with, hypothetically, and you just continue living your life anyways. There wouldn't be a point. You'd never be able to return to your exact timeline with your friends, your family. So you could be leaving all of those people as you once knew them behind in a world where you left and never came back. I wouldn't want
If
to do
you,
that to
yeah,
my family.
yeah.
Even
If you
even
do
if I
come,
returned.
yeah,
Hmm? Go
yeah.
ahead.
If you do come back to your timeline, like to this to come back from the past, come back to the future to this timeline, will will everything like you raised up a good point. It's like I don't like I doubt that everything will be the same the way you
No,
left
even
it.
if it were,
Yeah. You, yeah,
even if it
because
were
like
the same, you're you'd be different. You'd be a couple minutes older, if anything.
exactly. Yeah, because like if you think about it, like would 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 your friends even recognize you? Would your friends even remember you, or the ones that are close to you? I mean, that's the big question right there too.
You don't know. That's part of the spontaneity of the universe. You know, if we think about the Flash again, where he would go back in time, change something, then go back to the future, and some little things are different. Just like the uh, Hartley Rathway, the Pied Piper rogue. He came, he was alive and well and friendly. You know, little things like that where the, in the spontaneity of the universe and the spontaneity of the timeline, things are not necessarily going to be the same when you return. So there'd be no point in returning to the future. And
Hmm.
similarly, let's say you don't go back to 1964 from your timeline. Let's say we decide to go to the future. Alright, we're still going to one possible future course of events. So you could go to the future 20 years from now. Let's say, alright, we're in, well, you know what, let's just say for ease of conversation, let's go to 2050. We go to 2050, and let's say it's a zombie apocalypse scenario. That's still one possible future, you cannot guarantee that that is going to happen, and so it wouldn't make any sense for you to go to the future, because the future to see what's going to happen, because that's not necessarily going to happen. It might happen in one possible scenario in which you left the timeline and went to the future. But if you then went back to 2023 to try to prevent that, you'd be going back to a new timeline, because not the timeline that you, not necessarily the timeline that you left. It might be very similar to the timeline that you left, but it would still be operating on a different vibrational frequency, because as soon as you travel back to the past, you're in a new timeline, because that past becomes your future, which cannot be changed by anything that happens in the past. So all roads lead back to the present. That's why I like to talk about time travel, because it's fun. It's fun to theorize, fun to think, oh, what if we went to the future? What if we went to the past? But practically, it just wouldn't make sense. We'd be abandoning our past. We'd be abandoning our future. What kind of future would you make if you went back to 1964? That timeline, any changes that if you went back to the 40s and you prevent World War II, great, but that past is not going to change for everybody else. When you go to the future, that's going to be Back to the Future after preventing World War II or stopping it. That future is going to be completely different, first of all, and second, that change is not going to impact everyone that you know and love, because you can't return to that previous timeline. You just can't. So there'd be no point. So, what does that tell us? That tells us, at least it tells me, you create your own future. Just as Doc Brown said, your future is whatever you make it. And that includes your past to some extent. We can't change the events and mechanics of our past necessarily, even if we were to time travel. Right? If you time travel back, you change something, that doesn't change where you came from. It doesn't change the memory of that past. It just
Yeah.
doesn't.
I mean,
That's
look,
not how time travel works.
we would all be happy to go back and time travel back to the 40s and try to warn people and warn people about the Holocaust, or trying to stop Hitler. But at time, well, it doesn't change for everyone. Everyone's past in the 40s as well.
Right?
So, and how does that? And if we and it might, like, if we try to interfere, then then it could have some consequences. Maybe that World War II couldn't have ended, and maybe it could have had a different decision. Yeah,
Maybe.
yeah,
And all of these scenarios do exist, because there's an infinite number of timelines. The multiverse is infinite. Some very small, minor timeline changes, and some major. It's all about coming to terms with our past in the present and creating our future moving forward. Because
hmm
that's part of why, even if time travel were to be invented today, even if we heard about it, we wouldn't be impacted by it. because they would go back in time, change something in the past, but then as soon as they return to the future, they're not returning to our timeline. They're returning to the new timeline they created when they travel back to the past. So that's why we may not hear ever about time travelers coming to our timeline and warning us about the future. If you do,
Right.
beware, because even if they do catch our attention, say a time traveler comes out and says, "Oh, in 20 years, we're going to have World War III," we're trying to prevent that from happening. The timeline that they came from is just one possible future, not necessarily the one that he came back and traveled back to. So it wouldn't even make sense for them to time travel back to our timeline. If they did, realistically, don't believe them, because we create
Yeah.
our own futures and we interpret our own pasts, and that can really increase our presence. I think, at least for me, in accepting the present moment, accepting that I don't necessarily want to be in the future. I don't necessarily want to be in the past. Just be in the present. Because that's where you create the future. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, you pretty much said it all. We got to be aware of no matter how hard we try or how hard we're could have those opportunities. We need to be aware of the consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alright, well, that's going to do it for this video. Make sure you order your thinking caps at jacktemporary.com/the thinking cap. Get
And I'll get my
those.
thinking cap. I'll get my own thinking cap soon, and I'll order
Excellent.
that soon.
Excellent. Looking forward to that. And if you want to be a guest on the Thinking Cap, go ahead and go over to our Facebook page, the Thinking Cap Podcast. And if you go into services, there's a spot where you can book an appointment. Technically, you can book. We record on Wednesdays. If you'd like to, if you got a topic that you want to talk about, you're very passionate about, or interested in, or just want to think things through a little bit more deeper, a little bit more critically, go book that
Uh-oh.
appointment. We'll keep in touch and find a good topic, a good date and time to go ahead and record a Thinking Cap episode. Eventually, we would like to be recording these live. However, we have not yet hit to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. So if you're watching on YouTube or on your other favorite podcasting platform, go on YouTube, make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel, because when we hit 1,000 subscribers, that's when we would be able to go live. And so if you want to see us live, make sure to go subscribe.
Mm.
Also, if you want to follow me at Jack Temperley Plus, you can go do so. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. I post the clips from the Thinking Cap as well as some other interesting content. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. If you're on Apple or Google Podcasts or Spotify or another podcasting platform, I see you. I see the stats. We've got US for the most part, but we've also got some German listeners as well. Shout out to all of you. Make sure you leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. That's going to tell the algorithms that this is a podcast worth listening to. And I hope that we are worth listening to. That's the whole point of this podcast, to not only listen, but to think. Again, think with your cap, think with your head. That'll do it for this episode. make sure to keep listening, stay thinking, stay alive. We'll see you in the next episode.
Top guys out.